After the British Army left Concord, they began a grueling, bloody 16-mile forced march all the way back to Boston. And to make matters worse for them, the word had gotten out. Thousands and thousands of militia from all the surrounding towns began descending upon Concord, and they all knew what road the British had to take back east towards Boston. So for the rest of the day, as the British made their way back eastward, they were just pummeled and attacked multiple times by thousands and thousands of militia as they just descended upon the road. Alright, today I'm going to be taking you down some portions of the Battle Road. Now, the Battle Road is about 5 miles long. Today, it's part of the Minuteman National Historical Park. What's really cool about it is there are a lot of witness houses, there are a lot of British gravesites, and other neat things that we can check out as we go along. This is the Nathan Meriam House. And this is one of many witness houses that are within Minuteman National Historical Park. And kind of touched on it before, but a witness house is basically a structure that stood at that time and it witnessed the history. It witnessed what took place on April 19th. And here at Meriam's Corner, just outside Concord, this is really where the British Army, as they proceeded and retreated east towards Boston, where they really met their first major resistance. Again, hundreds and eventually thousands of militiamen descended down upon them and utilized the rocks, the trees, the landscape, the areas that they knew really well to their advantage. Hid behind them, took shots at the British, ran off, were able to hide again, reload, and continue to proceed down. So the British did end up adopting a strategy that worked really well, in that they put out flankers and soldiers on either side of the columns, oftentimes well off the road and out into the woods to help dislodge, take on these militiamen that were using the trees and the woods and the rocks to their advantage. And here at Meriam's Corner, we find another one of the grave sites to a British soldier that's buried near here. And this is actually now the second British grave site we've seen here near Concord. And there are actually 7 total British grave sites throughout Minuteman National Historical Park. This is a pretty unique location on the Battle Road. You can kind of see it. There's this sharp bend in the road right here. This would have been the same back in 1775 when this was known as the Bay Road. And this sharp bend today is known as the Bloody Angle. It's known as the Bloody Angle because as the British column retreated through this area, these sharp bends, they were met by enemy fire on both sides. And you can see between large rocks, trees, undergrowth, obviously some of this is different than it was back then, but really not too much. Overall, the countryside in some of these areas, outside of the fields that were cultivated, pretty thick trees, lots of stone walls, lots of large rocks, and the militia really used that to their advantage. So as the battle raged here at the Bloody Angle, it continued eastward down that road towards the Hartwell Tavern, and some British soldiers were killed, some militiamen injured and killed, and similar to what we've seen in other parts of the park, here we do have another grave site marking the location of where multiple British soldiers were buried that died right here at the Bloody Angle on April 19th. One thing that's great about Minuteman National Historical Park is they have a lot of good signage throughout, especially as you're walking down the Battle Road. So if you want to use the NPS app or grab one of the National Park Service pamphlets, those are awesome. But if you don't have either of those, as you walk around, don't worry, there is going to be plenty of signs to tell you what happened with where you're at. And here on the battle map, you can kind of get a better idea. So where the running battle began at Meriam's Corner, now we're all the way through here, through the woods, part way down the Battle Road. And here at the Bloody Angle, you see men from Meriam's Corner and the North Bridge in Concord. You see men from Lincoln, Woburn militia, others that descended on the area and attacked the British column right here. I really like this artwork they have on here too. It kind of gives you a good idea of perhaps what it might have looked like. You had the British flankers out in the woods, but of course you also had the Patriot militia utilizing trees, rocks, and anything else to hide behind a fire and then reload. I've just always enjoyed walking down the Battle Road. I think, because you can walk it, you can run it, you can even ride your bike down it if you'd like, and people seem to always be pretty respectful of, the history, especially those parts where there are British soldiers buried. Yeah, it's just a good way to connect with nature out here, and, it's a nice April evening and you can hear the birds chirping all around me. It's just very, very peaceful, very relaxing, and for a history nerd like me, you can also get your history fix. Now this right here is the Hartwell Tavern. Now this is one of my favorite structures in the park, and it's located, right on the Battle Road, formerly known as the Bay Road, and the British soldiers would have marched right by this tavern twice, obviously early in the morning on the way out to Concord, and then on the way back. It was built around 1732 and 1733, so this thing's almost 300 years old. And in the early morning hours of April 19th, the British column, as mentioned, did march right by this tavern. And Ephraim and Elizabeth's daughter-in-law, Mary Hartwell, she recalled seeing the British troops and their glinting bayonets pass by. But even though the British troops marched by this tavern twice, there's no evidence that they ever, entered the tavern or made any efforts to ransack it, catch it on fire, or anything of that nature. Another cool site here along the Battle Road that you're definitely not going to want to miss is the Paul Revere capture site. Now, I think it's kind of funny that we all have a little bit of an obsession with the Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, when in fact there were, really dozens of other riders by the end of the morning. But, Paul Revere and William Dawes, who were dispatched by Dr. Joseph Warren, get a lot of the attention. They did make it to Lexington. They did warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And along the way, once they left Lexington, on their way to Concord, they actually encountered a man named Samuel Prescott. Now, as the story goes, Samuel Prescott was actually on his way home after seeing one of his lady friends. He decided to join them, head to Concord, and also pass the word. Well, of course, in preparation for the British march, the British Army had groups of officers patrolling on horseback around the countryside. And unfortunately for Paul Revere, they encountered one of these groups of officers. And here you see Dawes, Revere, and Prescott at 1:30 a.m. on April 19th, 1775. They encountered this group of British officers, and amidst the tussle, Samuel Prescott was able to escape, leaped his horse over a fence, and continued on to Concord. William Dawes also escaped, although nobody's really sure exactly what happened to him after he escaped. He may have headed back towards Boston or somewhere else. And Paul Revere, of course, was captured out of the three. And this site is now memorialized with a monument, but they also have some cool signs as well that go into a little bit of the history. So it talks about William Dawes and Paul Revere as midnight riders. Of course, this wasn't the first time either of them have gone out on a long ride out into the countryside to warn their fellow Whigs of things that were going on in Boston. There's also this really cool tablet in place that goes through a ton of the history. And it says, "At this point on the old Concord Road, as it then was, ended the midnight ride of Paul Revere. He had about 2 o'clock in the morning of April 19th, 1775, the night being clear and the moon in its third quarter, got thus far on his way from Lexington to Concord, alarming the inhabitants as he went, when he and his companions, William Dawes of Boston and Dr. Samuel Prescott of Concord, were suddenly halted by a British patrol who had stationed themselves at this bend of the road. Dawes, turning back, made his escape. Prescott, clearing the stone wall and following a path known to him through the low ground, regained the highway at a point further on and gave the alarm at Concord. Revere tried to reach the neighboring wood, but was intercepted by a party of officers accompanying the patrol, detained and kept in arrest. Presently, he was carried by the patrol back to Lexington and there released, and that morning rejoined Hancock and Adams. And that doesn't really go into some of the story of that, where, they took Paul Revere's horse, and as they were heading back towards Lexington, what they believe was the Lexington militia clearing their muskets on the green. The British officers and Paul Revere heard this large discharge of guns, and Revere basically convinced them, look, there's at least 500 militia waiting for you in Lexington. And the British officers basically got to the point where they said, okay, well, he's probably telling the truth. So they actually released Paul Revere and headed out on their own. I'm starting to lose daylight here, so I'm going to finish up my time taking you down the battle road at the site of Parker's Revenge. So if you remember, Captain John Parker, leader of the Lexington militia, they were devastated with what happened on their town green. It was unexpected, it was not planned, and after losing 7 of his fellow townsmen and then the other man from Woburn, so 8 men died total at Lexington, John Parker gathered his men and they began marching west, and they fully intended on intercepting the British soldiers as they headed back to Boston, and that's exactly what they did. And it was at this spot and in these woods where a lot of these massive glacial rocks are that John Parker and his men ambushed the British and poured an incessant fire and killed numerous soldiers and really exacted their revenge. This was just another chapter as the British continued heading east towards Boston, and really outside of the battle road here, after the British paused in Lexington and got much needed reinforcements that basically probably saved the British because they were exhausted, they were running out of ammo. If they didn't have that relief force come meet them in Lexington, they probably would have been fully killed or captured by the militia that day. But at any rate, they continued east, and really the bloodiest fighting on April 19th took place in the town of Menotomy, modern-day Arlington, by the Jason Russell House and the Rocks and some of these other areas that are just kind of overgrown by modern roads and buildings, but there are still some cool sights to see. Back here, still at the Parker's Revenge site, you can see some of these just massive rocks that the Patriots would have utilized. And of course, these rocks have been formed over thousands of years, and we're certainly here on April 19th, 1775. And there's this lone British flag, which I imagine is marking the site of a likely gravesite for a British soldier who died here. Well, I'm going to leave you guys with that here at the site of Parker's Revenge. The battle road, all 5 miles of it, are outstanding. A good portion of it, too, actually follows along the original Bay Road that the British would have marched down. And it's sites like this, like Parker's Revenge, that really kind of make you feel kind of the spirit and some of the raw emotion that both sides must have felt that day. John Parker and the Lexington militia, devastated, really seeking that revenge and wanting to avenge the deaths of their brothers, their fathers, their uncles, their cousins, their neighbors. And the British, exhausted, not really understanding how quickly, a night march to go capture supplies developed into an absolute rout, and, them just trying to get back to the safety of Boston. I don't think either side realized when the shooting started that day, the shot that nobody knows who fired at Lexington Green, the shot heard around the world at Concord Bridge, where Patriot militia were ordered to fire on British soldiers for the first time. I don't think either side could have imagined what April 19th, 1775 was going to bring for them, and ultimately kick off the Revolutionary War and lead to, really 7-8 years of grueling war, and ultimately American independence, which, is, I guess, the price of blood. But thank you guys for following along, coming with me down some parts of the Battle Road Trail, and exploring the Lexington and Concord area. Again, if you're ever in the area, you got to stop. I would give yourself at least a couple days to check all this out, because there's so much to do, so much to see, a lot of great museums. But I'll tell you what, at the end of the day, being out here on the Battle Road in nature, that's hard to beat. And to think that these peaceful fields and trails were once covered in the blood of our countrymen, of British soldiers, and wild times. Anyway, until the next time, appreciate you guys coming along with me on this journey.